Skyward Sword has apparently become the most reviled game in the Zelda series. Although it was extremely well received by critics, it was clear from the outset that a lot of players were rejecting the game, and it failed to sell half as much as Twilight Princess. The easy answer is to blame motion control, but beyond that, it wasn't the game the series needed at the time. The Zelda staff knew they had to innovate more after feeling bored by Twilight Princess, but they weren't willing to commit to a full reboot, and they didn't have the hardware to expand things at a technical level. Instead, they chose to arbitrarily rearrange certain parts of the Zelda formula. One of their biggest experiments was to treat the overworld more like a dungeon. Normally, Zelda connects its areas with a large hub that players will traverse over and over again, with a few quests and secrets emerging as the player explores. The landscape visibly changes as you travel, and everything is interconnected in a way that feels like a living, dynamic world, even in the ancient N64 games. Skyward Sword splits its overworld up into 3 separate areas that don't connect or transition into one another in any way. Aside from a glimpse of Death Mountain on the horizon, these segments could be on different planets from one another. The formula for exploration is that you enter each area from a closed-off starting point, then navigate a path with obstacles and enemies until you loop back around and unlock a shortcut, which lets you bypass the path you just took forever. In that sense, the world is disposable. Most areas only have meaning as a brief resistance to your progress. Once you reach a warp statue, even more of the world is discarded to never be traversed again. When the game tries to recycle these areas later on, it feels unnatural, because these narrow obstacle gauntlets don't lend themselves well to free exploration. Everything feels like a video game level rather than a world. Even the day and night cycles found in every other 3D Zelda are absent, with time oddly fixed in place while exploring. Linear obstacle-filled gameplay works in a dungeon where you've committed to the goal of finding and killing a boss. It's a short burst of more intense gameplay, and you get rewarded with items at regular intervals to keep you motivated. In the overworld, you don't know exactly what the goal is, how much more exploring there will be before you get there, and there aren't any items to keep you interested. The world should serve as a complement to the dungeons where you can explore freely and do whatever you want. That's why extending the dungeons into it doesn't really work. The one area of the game that does allow for open exploration is a total disappointment. The sky is even more barren than Wind Waker's sea, with only a few islands worth visiting, and it takes a lot of flapping to get to them. The bulk of the game's side content is on Skyloft, which has a few Majora's Mask-style quests, but not enough to drive the whole game in the way that Clocktown did. The staff's energy might have been better spent on either filling the sky with content, or on filling Skyloft, rather than trying to do both and coming up short. Normally when a Zelda game releases, the reputation of the previous game improves. It's called the Zelda cycle. A lot of people criticized Wind Waker's visuals at release, but after the snooze fest that was Twilight Princess, people came to appreciate just how much style and character the game had. Likewise, Skyward Sword made people appreciate just how competent Twilight Princess was as a standard Zelda game. The same has not happened with Breath of the Wild, which has only made Skyward Sword's faults more glaring. Its unbroken overworld is by far the most open and lifelike in the series, with dynamic weather and temperature systems so detailed that they change with altitude. Right from the start, there's such a wealth of things to do and see that it's easy to get distracted and forget what you were even doing in the first place. Zelda stemmed from Miyamoto's childhood exploration of the outdoors, and no game captures that spirit better than this. An entire game's worth of satisfying content can be had while ignoring the main quest. I don't want to say that Breath of the Wild's approach to exploration is better than Skyward Sword's in every way, but I struggle to come up with one in which it isn't. Combat is another victory for Breath of the Wild. For the record, the appeal of swinging a sword around with your own movements is obvious. A game called Red Steel 2 executed that concept perfectly a year before Skyward Sword. You had a variety of attacks to perform with different button combinations and swings that all felt reliable, and the way that you used them to engage enemies in combat felt unlike anything that had been done on a controller before. It was like a game from the future, with a totally new kind of gameplay that worked so well that it made an otherwise mediocre game feel like a revolution. Skyward Sword fell far short of this. To make use of one-to-one motion, almost all combat in the game involves directional swings delivered at just the right time. Even the pettiest enemies have a directional weakness built into them. The freedom to move your sword in any way you want was negated by the requirement of always having to swing in a specific direction. The Girahim fights open up a little bit and end up being the best examples of motion enabling something compelling and new to happen. The rest of the time, the use of motion is fairly shallow. The hardware itself also didn't seem up to the task. The bamboo cutting game is like a race to see how fast your controller can lose calibration. The sensor bar was needed to cancel drift, which is probably why Red Steel 2 worked so much better. As a first-person shooter, the remote is naturally pointed at the bar during gameplay. A lot of players seemed unaware that Skyward Sword used the bar at all, which may explain why some people had better experiences than others. There's been some rumbling about Skyward Sword HD coming to Switch, but the controls would only end up being worse without having a sensor bar to recalibrate with, or a magnetometer to cancel drift like the Wii U had. Breath of the Wild manages to find much more compelling ways to deepen combat while using a regular controller. The influence from other modern games can be seen in the new layer of stealth mechanics and bullet time attacks. Players can use a wide range of weapons with different advantages and weaknesses, and the physics-based gameplay lets you attack enemies with the environment, or even a piece of scrap metal. All of this is far more interesting than directional swinging. There are hundreds of little improvements that make Breath of the Wild the better game, but it has major shortcomings of its own. The rebooted open-world gameplay is so successful that it's easy to gloss over the more mediocre elements, but as the hype wears off, those weaknesses become harder and harder not to see. And in the same way that Breath of the Wild improves on Skyward Sword's weaknesses, Skyward Sword succeeded where Breath of the Wild failed. Breath of the Wild only has 4 dungeons. That by itself isn't a problem. Majora's Mask only had 4 dungeons and is objectively the best game ever made and has Tingle in it. But Majora's dungeons were the culmination of an entire quarter of the game. As soon as you enter an area, you begin working through the series of challenges that will lead you to the entrance of the temple. Each temple reflects the culture and history of its area and stands apart from the others with a distinct atmosphere. They're further separated by their heavy use of different forms, and halfway through some new item will be put to creative use to unlock the remaining puzzles. Like the temples themselves, the bosses are all unique monsters with totally different designs and fights. Breath of the Wild's dungeons aren't the culmination of much of anything. In fact, they equate to a fraction of the time you'll probably spend collecting iguanas. In spite of the game's vast amount of content, they actually seem shorter than usual, and while the lack of items can lead to interesting flexibility in the puzzles, it also leads to solving things in a way that doesn't seem right, but that sort of works anyway, which isn't the most rewarding feeling. They all share the same Sheikah technology aesthetic, and aside from their emphasis on different elements like fire or water, are basically the same temple. The player is likely to already be bored of this look before even setting foot in the first dungeon, because it's also used in the 120 shrines throughout the game. The biggest sacrifice made while transitioning to a vast open world is that the dungeons and shrines are a copy and paste job, and lack the character that Zelda dungeons should have. Not only did Skyward Sword have more dungeons, but they were far more creative and memorable. The Ancient Cistern is based on Akutagawa's short story The Spider's Thread, in which the Buddha is strolling along a lotus pond in paradise when he sees a sinner in the blood pools of hell through the water, and casts a spider's thread down for him to escape with. The narrative quality and the contrast between paradise and hell make for a dungeon that's unlike anything else in the series. Then Link uses a time-shifting stone to revert a desert back into an ancient ocean, and boards a drifting vessel where time continues to shift between the boat and its glory days and the ghost ship it's become. The final dungeon is a gigantic sliding puzzle that has Link rearranging the rooms themselves. Even the less ambitious dungeons have a distinct character and mood that sets them apart from the previous dungeons in the series. The same applies to the bosses. Girahim is fucking nuts, and every second he's on screen is the best second of the game. Having something that resembles a sword fight with a human enemy is a welcome change of pace from gigantic monsters. But Skyward Sword does well in the monster department too. Koloktos is a haunted Buddhist statue that has to be dismantled piece by piece using its own gigantic sword. The boss of the sand ship isn't fought in the boss room at all, and instead tears the ship apart in the lead up to the actual battle. Echoing one of the most memorable moments in Metroid 2, a giant scorpion is uncovered in the sand of an old mine. Now that you've seen all of these, here are Breath of the Wild's 4 bosses. Can you tell which one is which?
I think you're lying.
Just like the dungeons themselves, the bosses feel like the same enemy copied and pasted with a different elemental twist each time. They all have the same exploitable eyeball weakness and can be fought with fairly similar strategies. Even Ganon himself is an offshoot of this design. The lack of ingenuity in the temples and bosses is almost pathetic compared to the designs in Skyward Sword. And now I'd like to talk about rain. Making it a little harder to climb in the rain makes sense. Making it nearly impossible, even with the full climbing gear, is a bad choice in a game based on free exploration. If you get caught in a storm while climbing, you basically have 3 options. Give up on all of your progress and go do something else, which is unappealing right on the face of it. Or set up a campfire, or just stop playing for 5 to 10 minutes. Absolutely none of this is fun, but at least this happens every now and then. I appreciate what the game was trying to do with weapon durability. You're always foraging and procuring supplies from the landscape, and it leads to battles with mops and other weapons you would never use if you had some unbreakable sword. But you shouldn't be able to burn through your whole inventory in a single battle. Swords should only be breaking this fast on the Great Plateau, when the game is acclimating you to the mechanics. The balancing takes the fun out of the weapons. The weak ones are unsatisfying and ineffective, and you can never use the powerful ones without feeling like you're wasting them. Upgrading a weapon in previous games was one of the most rewarding feelings in the series. In Breath of the Wild, it's like a team of scientists engineered the precise opposite of that feeling in a lab. Skyward Sword also had a durability mechanic, but it's easy to forget because it was so rarely an issue. Shields only took damage when failing to counter, allowing skilled players to avoid breakage entirely. Had Breath of the Wild done something similar and only doled out damage when swings were blocked, the system wouldn't have been such a drag on gameplay. Skyward Sword also opened up every item in the inventory for upgrades in exchange for collectibles. I would have liked to see a character like this in Breath of the Wild who could repair your broken weapons for a price. That way you could upgrade and invest in them just like your armor, and you'd still have chances for foraging in the downtimes when your sword of choice was broken. Travel is another mixed bag. It's handled better than most open-world games I've played thanks to great ideas like the glider, which is so natural I find myself trying to use it in past Zeldas. But there are a lot of areas with no horse access and no good alternatives for fast travel. By the time you track down a seal in the desert, you probably could have just run to your destination, and it's there that the stamina meter becomes a big frustration. Skyward Sword's small environments matched well with that game's stamina meter, and there were always refills scattered around. But Breath of the Wild's stamina wheel feels pitifully outmatched by the scale of the world. There were a lot of missed opportunities to provide better gear for travel. The stealth suit allows for slightly faster running, but only at night. The Zora armor barely swims faster than default and is only useful for swimming up waterfalls. Something akin to Majora's Mask's Zora speed with a full outfit on would have made it extremely useful throughout the entire game. The story is my final point of comparison, and it's an interesting one since the games share the same basic plot. Some form of Ganon is on the verge of causing the extinction of humanity, when Zelda intervenes and uses her powers to seal him away, until the chosen hero is able to appear decades later, just in time for Zelda's seal to fail and for Link to face and ultimately defeat the threat. In spite of sharing the same story beats, the difference in presentation is gigantic. As someone who's complained about story derailing gameplay before, I can appreciate that Breath of the Wild starts off with next to no introduction before turning the player loose. It's the same kind of laser focus on gameplay that Nintendo had in the 2D era. But as the game goes on, it's hard not to feel like something is missing. The Legend of Zelda is just that, a legend or fairy tale. It's inevitable that there's going to be some storytelling built in, and I'm not averse to that if it enhances the gameplay. Even the silent Super Metroid had a narrative that boosted the drama of the ending. Skyward Sword's introduction didn't need to be as long as it was, but it succeeded in setting up the characters and their relationships. I cared by the time that Zelda was sucked down to the surface, because the game took the time to forge a connection with her character, and that connection makes Link's transition into the hero more compelling. Part of the appeal of video games is to escape the complicated stupidity of the real world, and to become an unfailing hero on some simple, righteous mission, because in real life morality is cloudy, and my actions would look a lot more like this.
Hey, you can't drink that here.
Get off your street, you fucking bum.
Luckily, Link isn't an alcoholic, and we get to experience his transition into the hero as the real adventure begins, and we see the relationships established in the introduction develop as the game goes on. We learn about the threat both directly and indirectly, making its reveal in the final fight more interesting. Ganon has been presented differently in each game. In Ocarina of Time, he was a manipulator who cheated his way to world domination, while in Wind Waker he was humbled to the point of being sympathetic. Demise turns out to be a conquering barbarian so used to slaughtering humans that he's intrigued by the thought that Link might actually pose a threat to him. Once he's been eliminated, there are twists and revelations, and Link has to part ways with several characters, and this is where the payoff of the storytelling is clear to see. Even if you found Fi annoying in the game, it's hard not to feel a sense of sadness watching your character effectively die. If you were to summarize Breath of the Wild's story, it would be, Link, fuck around until Hyrule is saved. The only real plot comes in the form of memories involving characters that are long dead and that Link can't do anything for in the present. Everyone who was asking for voice acting got their wish with something so robotic that it sounds like I could have delivered it.
So if this Calamity Ganon does in fact return, what can we really do?
The ultimate value of these scenes seems to be to remind the player that Ganon is a bad guy, but that's already hinted at by the fact that everyone is dead. The best storytelling is done through the world itself. You never feel more heroic than when saving a random character from harm, and it's interesting to piece together what happened on battlefields by observing the aftermath. But even here, there's only so much that can be done without any real music or story structure to build on the idea. Skyward Sword has a moment where an ancient robot is brought into the present by a time-shifting stone. Unable to leave the time bubble, he asks Link to travel to his house, where the player sees the rusted remains of his family, and images of what his life used to be like. It's an unexpected and memorable moment made possible by the structured story leading up to it and the prominent soundtrack. Link didn't just aimlessly wander in without context. Compare this to Lon Lon Ranch in Breath of the Wild. Anyone who's played Ocarina of Time will feel some kind of impact seeing the familiar landscape and ruins, but the game doesn't seem to know that. There's no reaction at all from the soundtrack. It may as well just be another random pile of bricks. Past games would have memorable themes to give every area a certain character. Breath of the Wild only has music like this in the towns. While the world is mostly silent with the same piano jingles playing no matter where your location. I understand that the Impressionist soundtrack suits the broken nature of the world, and it would probably get annoying to hear the same song for 20 minutes while climbing on a mountain. But there are times when the game needs variation and emotional impact that the detached score doesn't provide. The real weakness of Breath of the Wild's storytelling is exposed by the ending. After preparing for it the entire game, it's incredibly climactic to storm into Hyrule Castle and fight a path to Ganon. It's one of the highlights of the game, maybe even the whole series. But it's hard not to be a little disappointed when Ganon turns out to be another robot monster without any development. You may as well swap him with one of these guys. Skyward Sword ended with back-to-back intense, one-on-one sword fights with villains that had some actual character. Breath of the Wild ends with a giant pig letting you shoot it in a field. It's a fun spectacle to end the game on, but there's no substance beyond that. You'd really have to try to get hurt by this thing. Once Ganon is dead, there's nothing left to work with. Zelda and Link just kind of stand there and then it ends. Spoilers. The time that Skyward Sword spends on story pays off by making the gameplay more dramatic and delivering a satisfying conclusion. Breath of the Wild's approach is fine if you treat it like an 8-bit game with an extremely simple story of a good guy killing a bad guy, but in that case, you don't need all these cutscenes, and I don't think I'd have missed much if I skipped most of them. The Zelda staff has a history of taking fan feedback to heart, often to the point of overcorrecting, and Breath of the Wild may have been another overcorrection. Like Ocarina of Time, it founded an all-new way of playing Zelda. But unlike Ocarina of Time, the content on top of that foundation isn't particularly strong when you examine it. It's the kind of game that leaves so much room for improvement that it could be rendered obsolete by a good sequel. And for me, that means bringing back more of the old Zelda magic, and Skyward Sword just happens to have the kind of content that Breath of the Wild was sorely lacking. So if the Zelda staff is still listening, it would be a good idea not to make Skyward Sword seem so toxic that they avoid touching it at all costs. And it would be good not to give Breath of the Wild's shortcomings a free pass in light of all the great things it accomplished. I give Skyward Sword 7 twerking tingles. Its heart was in the right place and it has some great moments, but it was a transitional title where Nintendo still hadn't figured out what the series needed yet. Breath of the Wild gets 8 durians out of Mask Salesman. It has the best core gameplay in the series, but it needed more time to sort out everything else. Here's hoping the sequel achieves exactly that.